Welcome to the State of Accessibility podcast from Vispero. This is episode 18. I'm David Sloan, Chief Accessibility Officer, and each month I'm joined by a guest or two to discuss a topic of interest and relevance to the practice and profession of digital accessibility. And for this episode, the April 2026 episode, we're returning to a topic that we've addressed in several previous podcasts and really honestly, which we can't ignore for any length of time, given the rapid pace of change. Yep, it's artificial intelligence again. And joining me this month to discuss what's changed in AI's impact on digital accessibility efforts is a core member of Vispero's Knowledge Centre, Principal Technical Writer, Ricky Onsman. So welcome, Ricky.
Thank you, David. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, and thank you for getting up early to join us for this conversation. I know you've been tracking the impact of AI on digital accessibility for a while now, and it sounds like from your very first effort once you joined TPGI Vispero. So talk through what's piqued your interest, how you've been tracking and reporting on progress in AI from an accessibility perspective over recent years. And you could include kind of defining the different types of AI that are making a difference to how we build and make sure that digital content's accessible.
Sure. Just for perspective, so that a lot of people won't know exactly what the Knowledge Centre is, what we do is we write the guidance for our TPGI, Vispero accessibility engineers. So we work on the rules engine that people use to assess and audit whether websites and apps are meeting accessibility requirements. And we provide guidance to our clients on how to address specific accessibility issues. So artificial intelligence comes very strongly into our kind of area of work. And in fact, I've been working for Vispero, for TPGI, for 5.5 years. And I realized the other day, the first thing I actually did for TPGI was write a blog post on artificial intelligence. I reviewed that the other day, and I actually now, 5.5 years later, I would write a very different article. Um, it was it was very positive, and I remain positive about artificial intelligence. And I think we should make that clear from the start. I think it has enormous potential in society in general, but very specifically in how we approach digital accessibility. I think it has been a hard slog in the world of digital accessibility. And there are a lot of ways that artificial intelligence can help us to achieve our aims in making the digital world a more accessible place. Having said that, I think one of the things that has probably changed in the way I think about artificial intelligence is, first of all, we've got to stop calling it artificial intelligence. For one thing, it's not very intelligent. It's a terrific tool, but a lot of it is just automation, and it's not doesn't necessarily show a great deal of insight. Um, as an example of that, when I ask a generative AI chat model to, uh, let's say, I have a set of code here, and it's got a bunch of divs and spans in it. How do I make them accessible? And what it will tell me is to use ARIA labels to make it accessible. And what it doesn't do is question my basic premise. It
Mm,
doesn't say, why are you using divs and spans? You should be using semantic HTML. It just answers the question that I put to it, but it doesn't make me question myself, and it doesn't make me think about what I'm doing. That's a real problem, because then we just perpetuate the same issues
mm,
instead of rethinking things. Now, that would be intelligence. And I don't see a lot of that evidence in what Claude, ChatGPT, the other artificial intelligence chat models do. Um, and they are almost sycophantic in that they will respond in a lovely conversational tone. Oh, that's a very good point. You've raised a terrific thing there, but they don't make me think. So I think one of the things there is we've just got to find a different name for it. And I guess one of the things that comes out there is that we should stop referring to it altogether. I think a good model for that is what happened with Google Translate. In 2016, Google Translate moved to an artificial intelligence model. Its accuracy rose by 80%, and nobody thought about it. Nobody questions it. Now you use Google Translate and you don't think I'm using artificial intelligence. You're just using Google Translate. What drives it, what powers it, is almost irrelevant. The question is, does it do a good job? If it does a good job, fantastic. And that's how we've got to kind of incorporate artificial intelligence into what we do with digital accessibility. So that when it helps us write code or address issues, we don't think about it being artificial intelligence. It's just a tool that's helping us to do our job. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it also helps move us on from this kind of pressure to be using AI, quote unquote, without really understanding what do you mean and what for. It's just it's almost like a bandwagon or something that you feel like you have to be doing and have to be showing that you're doing without really having the context of where can I make my work more efficient? Where can I make it quicker and reduce errors or whatever? So almost taking the underlying technology out of the equation and just thinking, what are the tools that I could be using that I'm not using now will stop people feeling, I don't know where to go, or worse, kind of turn the opposite direction and kind of walk away from something that could help them do their job more effectively. Putting aside that for now the reasonable concerns around AI in terms of the sort of economic and environmental aspects, but I do like the idea of just like let's get rid of the whole phrase and talk about the tools that absorb it and make use of it, and then maybe it becomes more, in a way, more accessible to people who just are always looking for tools to do their job
Yeah.
better. And I guess in the accessibility profession, that is a place where we're always looking at tools that can automate things that we trust will do a better job than we could do on our own, and cut down on errors and cut down in time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think there are two main drivers in that context. One is that it can help us to carry out tasks in an automated way that we can rely on. Um, and the other is that it can replace certain things that we do. So, in the latter context, what I'm thinking of is things like generating alternative text for images. Even 5 years ago, the job that it did was not very good, because what it did was it did the same thing that inexperienced accessibility engineers do when assessing the purpose of an image. They look at the image and say, it is this, it's a dog sitting at the base of a tree. And AI would generate alternative text that says, dog sitting at the base of a tree. It doesn't tell you why that image is there. Nowadays, they're actually a lot better.
Yeah.
Gemini has become very, very good at understanding the context of the image, why that is there, and telling you the dog is sitting at the base of the tree because it's hunting truffles. You know, and that comes from the surrounding text. It understands the context better. If we can get to the point where we don't have to think a lot about what we want to put in alternative text, we can rely on artificial intelligence to do it accurately. That's going to make our job a lot easier. And we know, you and I both know, that alternative text for images is one of the top issues that exists. We see
Hmm.
the WebAIM million report, and every year, and it's not getting better. And the same issues keep coming up that account for 90% of the problems that exist in accessibility on the web and in apps. And one of those is that images don't have alternative text at all when they should have, or that the alternative text doesn't convey what the image is actually supposed to convey. So if artificial intelligence can do that for us in an automated way, and we can trust it without having to think about it, then that works really well. Having said that, at this stage, I would not trust any AI to do that job for me. What I would like trust it to do is make suggestions that I check. So it comes up with, this is an image of something, and no, you're missing the point here. That's not what the purpose of this image is. The purpose of this image is this. And it then carries out that task for me. Now, that's a step in the right direction. It's not total automation because we can't rely on it with full confidence, but it is a step towards making our jobs easier. And that applies as well to using artificial intelligence in content management systems to say, you haven't put in alternative text for this image. What should it be? To make us question ourselves, and to act like a checklist of things that you need to do. And artificial intelligence is good at checklists. It's good at coming up with things like, have you done this? Have you done this? Have you done this? But it's still up to us to carry out the tasks. And it requires some human intervention, at least at this stage. Frankly, I don't see that changing a lot over time. An example of where we put too much trust in artificial intelligence is the dreaded overlays, which rely on, that you can, for a very low cost, install a widget on your website, press a button, and it will solve all the accessibility problems because it is AI powered. And that is just, it's basically almost snake oil. A single push button response to all accessibility issues on a website or an app is a long, long way off. But people are using them now. And that's a problem because it ends up causing more accessibility issues, not less.
Yeah, and this is a theme that I attended an AI and accessibility webinar last week that accessibility.com hosted. Mark Shapiro and Gerard Cohen talking about advances. And one of the things that I think it was Gerard said was that there are companies that look at AI as a way, oh, we can use this for our accessibility strategy and we can fire all our accessibility team. And then a more mature way to look at AI is we can empower our team to do more and do better. So there's this kind of line between, on one side, it's like a less mature approach that thinks that AI is already capable of replacing humans to do tasks like your accessibility, quality assurance. And like you say, it isn't. And that leaves companies with more problems to solve, but there's no longer any staff to address them. So how do you see that challenge being addressed over time, where you have this kind of less mature perspective that thinks that the technology is already can replace humans and they make decisions based on that, but then create problems further down the line that they don't have the capacity to fix?
I think one of the things that has created that is what a lot of people see as a big advantage of artificial intelligence, the conversational tone. That you're able to ask a question in human terms of a machine, and the machine responds in what appear to be human conversational tones. It's very convincing, and it's convinced of its own correctness. It doesn't question itself. It's only when you come back to it and say, "Are you sure that's right? I didn't think those two flags were the same thing." I mean, no, of course they're not the same thing. This is the correct answer. And she said, "No, I'm not sure that's totally the correct answer either." And they go, "No, it's not the correct answer. This is the correct answer." And everything is given with total certitude. And that is, it's certainly artificial, but it's not intelligent.
Yeah.
And we've got to get into the habit of thinking of it as an assistive tool. And this is where I think, if we come in our industry to think of artificial intelligence as another form of assistive technology, that would be a big step forward. Instead of thinking of it being the answer to everything and that it can be totally relied on, it's something that helps us to do something.
Mm.
And in those terms, I think we need to dial back the overconfidence that artificial intelligence exudes and turn it into something that's more interrogative and something that questions what's going on and tries to think about what possible answers it could be. If if I use ChatGPT and I ask it a question and it says, well, the answer could be this or this or this, that would be a lot more useful than it just coming out with one blatant answer that says, "Oh, I know the answer perfectly."
And then you have to have the persistence to say, "Are you sure?" And then it might, well, actually, no. So yeah, I like
Exactly.
that move towards thinking about it as a kind of decision support tool and a paired programming almost relationship where you're kind of working together and
Yeah, yeah.
figuring out the best way forward. So
But it's
when we
almost
think
like
about
a catch-22 in that you need the expertise to be able to doubt artificial intelligence. In which case, if you have the expertise, why do you need the artificial intelligence in the first place?
yeah, that's a good point. So you mentioned started off with an example of where AI doesn't sufficiently interrogate a coding practice that's suboptimal, let's say, and then tries to kind of remediate the code to improve accessibility. Have you seen, stepping back from that, have you seen, genuine advances in the accessibility quality of code that has been created by generative AI over the years? And if so, where have the advances come? What have been the factors there?
I think it kind of pertains to what we've just been talking about. It depends a lot, and we've come to understand that it depends a lot on what we ask artificial intelligence to do, the prompts that we give. Um, and if we set out a clear set of instructions of what our expectations are, artificial intelligence can achieve those outcomes very, very well. Check my code. Have I used everything correctly here? Um, is there a way of making this more accessible that I haven't considered? Those kind of tools that address those kind of issues have come a long way in recent years. The Copilot for coding that you get in things like Visual Studio Code, and even in Microsoft products, that kind of stuff. To give an example, when you're using a program like Microsoft Word, which becomes critical for digital accessibility because of where it goes to.
Yep.
If you have, at the moment, you have accessibility checkers in Microsoft Word, but not everybody uses them. If artificial intelligence is used to say, you must do this, I will check the accessibility of this document for you, whether you like it or not. And that has implications for, one of the big issues that I wrestle with is the accessibility of PDF documents on the web. And that is an area where, in generating PDF documents to be accessible, AI has become very good. For a start, it makes the source documents more accessible, and then it helps the process of the conversion into a PDF document accessible. Now, that still leaves a huge problem for us because that doesn't address all the PDF documents that are already there.
All right.
But it does help in creating new PDF documents that are accessible. And on that front, I think artificial intelligence is very good. And I think the way that companies like Adobe and Microsoft are using it to assist slash force users to consider accessibility issues is a very good thing. And
I
that's one area where it's been very, very good.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that in accessibility we get, yeah, and there are very valid reasons for doing so, where we get so focused on tools to help us test and remediate existing stuff, we kind of forget about all the new stuff that's being built. So that ends up also needing tested and a lot of remediation. So it's really encouraging to hear that the innovations are guiding authors of different levels of awareness. Let's face it, we talk about accessibility every day, but most people don't. So any
Yeah.
tool that kind of puts it into somebody's publishing workflow, whether they were expecting it or not, and just increases the chances that what they produce is more accessible than it would have been than it would have been had the AI not been there. I think that's a really encouraging thing. So do you see any kind
Yeah.
of maturity in best practices of using AI in digital content creation emerging? Whether it's tools or the way that you write prompts or the way that you feed the tool with examples of what you mean. Are we getting to a point where we're sharing best practices, or are people still kind of more figuring it out on their own at this point?
Well, I think it really comes down to your expectations and the limits that you put on artificial intelligence. And by that I mean when I first started using generative AI to ask questions, it became quickly apparent that the data set that AI was using was fundamentally flawed. Um, Largely, it draws on what's available on the web. And a lot of the information about digital accessibility on the web is fundamentally flawed, if not downright dangerous. Practices that really don't encourage digital accessibility. Where that has developed, and I think people like agencies like Vespero and other digital accessibility consultancies are coming to realize that you can set a specific data set for an artificial intelligence model to use. So instead of using a large language model, use a limited language model.
Mm-hmm.
At Vespero, what we've done is we've created a knowledge base assistant that uses AI to interrogate every audit we've ever done, every article we've ever written, every piece of guidance we've provided to a client, and we know we can rely on that. So we can rely on the artificial intelligence to produce advice based on sound information. And I think that becomes a very refined tool that is much more useful and practical and reliable. Um, so it becomes a bit of, like instead of what was touted as the huge advantage of AI, that it draws on all the information ever in the world, that it only relies on reliable information. And I think all of us are working on tools that do that. And I think that will make a very big difference, not only just in confidence, but in just in accuracy. Um,
Right.
you know, and that is happening. So I see that as a very useful thing, and it's not insignificant that it takes humans to shape that. We have to tell AI what we want it to do and what it should pay attention to and what it should not pay attention to. Um, and that's a slow process, because we need to figure out, well, how do we get that information right in the first place so that AI uses and spreads the right information.
Right.
And we're way off that, but it is part of the task that we have at the moment. And digital accessibility is a terrific crucible for that, because not only is there a lot of bad information out there, but it really matters. This is not a trivial matter. Making the digital world accessible to people with disabilities is only going to get more and more important. And whatever tools we can use to do that, we should use them. Artificial intelligence is undoubtedly a part of that scenario. But what we mustn't lose sight of is why we're doing it. And I mean, we all work in digital accessibility because it really matters. More and more people are having to rely on the digital world for information, for functionality, for processes to do with every aspect of their lives. And we have to make sure that that is accessible to people with disabilities so we don't disenfranchise them.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I guess it's a bit of there's a race between the content and code generated by the general large learning models, which are trained on code that may not be what we would want it to be trained on, and then the code that's created with the assistance of more specialized models that are more accessibility aware, will give more reliable best practice and guidance and examples. So this
Yeah.
race, where the sort of general world potentially is learning from bad practice and percolating or propagating bad practice, and then separately the smarter models that you were talking about, that are
Yeah.
assisting people. So I don't know. I don't know if where that race will head, and who's gonna win it. But and I know the part of it that we want to be on and support.
Yeah, there's an aspect to this that we haven't really spoken about so far. We've focused on within the digital accessibility industry how we use artificial
Hmm.
intelligence, but there's another aspect to it that I think is already becoming more pervasive and will continue to do so, where artificial intelligence assists the user. And I'm talking here about agentive artificial intelligence that makes a browser act like a screen reader, that lets a browser understand a particular user's needs and literally influence the presentation of web and app content to suit that individual user's needs, to customize digital experiences so that they meet every person's individual needs. That's an area that I think is going to explode, and in the short term. Browsers, by definition, have been for the average user. But if you can customize your browser to be something that is incredibly personalized to you, even to the extent of not looking like a browser, it just presents web content to you in the way that is most meaningful and useful to you, taking into account things like disabilities, language backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, all those kind of things. If you can have your own personal AI present web content to you in the way that you need it to be presented, that's a massive step forward. And that is something that I think will happen in the short term. We will see
Yeah,
that happening in the next couple of years.
absolutely. And then there's a whole other podcast to talk about how assistive technology can be empowered by agentic AI, and how your
Absolutely.
assistive technology is, the capability of it is amplified. you know, I don't know what kind of level of order, that you can ask your screen reader, whatever, to go and book my flight to Cancun, or wherever, and you're not even interacting with the website.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
agent can do things for you. So, empowering the browser or empowering the assistive technology, all of the lines in the model, the user agent, the authoring tool, the content, that classic W3C shared model of accessibility responsibility, all those lines seem to be getting really blurred with
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
evolution of AI, and the way that we kind of compartmentalize who's responsible for what in the accessibility world seems to be getting upended. And who knows
Yeah. Yeah.
where it's going to be in 2, 3, 10 years time.
Yeah. There are risks associated with that we should be aware of. We don't want to get to the point where artificial intelligence is compensating for bad code and bad markup.
Right.
Um, there's still, we have to make sure that the web content, digital experiences are presented in a way that artificial intelligence can present to a user in a meaningful and accessible way. Um, so, getting rid of code spaghetti is still, in fact, becomes more important than before. There is still going to be a role for people to make sure that they actually write code in a accessible way. Um, and it's a that is a considerable risk, because we've already seen how browsers will compensate for poor markup.
Hmm.
And they're mean. It's meant in a positive way of look, okay, they haven't coded that very well. That's okay. I'll ignore that and I'll present it as if it had been coded properly. Um, but that doesn't create a better digital world. And we've got to make sure that we actually do it correctly in the first place,
Right.
so that artificial intelligence does it correctly for the individual user.
Yep. And I guess ironically, the whole, back in the day when we were using search engine optimization as the SEO is very closely aligned with accessibility best practices, and now we're thinking of AI or Gen AI optimization is very closely aligned with accessibility best practices when you can make something machine readable, whether the machine is an assistive technology or a generative AI tool. Uh, it's all kind of helping, hopefully helping us all move forward in the right direction.
Yeah,
So
yeah. But
one
that's
thing,
also that's the thing with, like, in the early days of search engine optimization, the techniques that people used to optimize their websites for search were not all positive. Keyword
mhm,
stuffing, putting white text on white background so that machines would read it, but humans wouldn't see it. So
some
just
humans.
making it exactly, it's essential that we kind of think through what we're doing here and how it might be abused.
Yep, yep, absolutely. So one thing I wanted to ask about as you've been kind of surveying and researching into evolution of AI to support content creation, one clear opportunity and also a threat to accessibility is accessibility of AI tools. What evidence do we have that the user interface of generative AI tools and agents is getting easier to use by people with disabilities? I mean, I've heard kind of conflicting evidence that tools are more or less accessible to people with disabilities, and maybe if you're comfortable using a command line interface, you're a screen reader user, then everything's good. But again, that also requires a level of technical expertise that maybe can't be assumed by everybody. So have you seen any trends there in terms of accessibility of AI, Gen AI tools?
Yeah, and I think that that works on a number of levels. Um, one aspect is just the simple usability of the tool with the user interface. Um, there's kind of it's again it's two sides of a coin, because a lot of people with disabilities have become used to using assistive technologies that people who don't have disabilities, for them, it's a complete mystery. You Using a screen reader is like, and I have used a screen reader myself quite a lot, but I've seen people who are very adept at using screen readers, and they, operate on a completely different level. So there's a level of comfort with technology that assists them in their daily tasks that coincides with the way that you might use assistive technology, that might use artificial intelligence. So on that level, there is a kind of a prospect there for people who are comfortable with using what you might call unusual tools. Um, at the same time, I think when artificial intelligence kind of broke through the what you might call the conversational banner, it
Hmm.
became a lot more usable by people in general. There was very little thought given to accessibility at that point. I think things that are happening now are influencing that. That if you are going to produce a tool that is meant to be used by everybody, it has to be designed to be used by everybody. Um, and there are efforts in that direction. I think the companies that create the artificial intelligence tools are becoming aware that, as with everything else, there is a market for people with disability, and you don't want to ignore that. There is a cultural imperative, there is a social need to make those tools accessible. That's an evolutionary thing, and it takes pressure to make that happen.
Yeah.
Um, the efforts of people like Joe Devon in setting benchmarks for how AI tools approach accessibility. That's going to be very, very important. The good thing is that most of those companies creating the AI tools are open to that. They're not deliberately trying to create inaccessible tools. They want it to be accessible. They just haven't given a lot of thought up until now. Um, so I see that as being an area of progress. There are some things that are built in that make that process a little easier. The fact that you can use voice access to
Mm,
use artificial intelligence is a very positive thing, and it's something that actually moves the dial forward for people with physical disabilities who can't use their hands. Can't use a keyboard at all, can't use a mouse. They use voice access. That's tremendously empowering. Um, Having said that, you've then got to make sure that the AI tools don't rely on voice alone, because then people who have voice impediments can't use the tools. So it has to be something that is customizable to meet the needs of individual people. And we're a little way off that yet. I think as we get to the things we were talking about with browsers being AI influenced and customizable by individuals, that will influence a lot of the more general AI tools that are available. And it will become, there's no reason why artificial intelligence tools can't be customizable to individual needs. But that's a
yep,
process. And it's
yep,
something that people in our industry need to exert influence on that to make it
yeah,
happen.
absolutely. Yeah, the accessibility field is an important role to play there. So we're approaching end of time. I'm going to ask you a couple of very quick questions with quick answers. See
Okay.
how you respond. Firstly, do you see the trend for around AI? Are people moving from skeptic to enthusiast or vice versa? Or do you see a kind of sort of stability in terms of uh, enthusiasm? Do you see any change in how people line up to how AI can help accessibility efforts?
Okay. Quick answer, yes, I do. But it depends on what form of artificial intelligence you're talking about. For things like translation, absolutely. That's a positive move. For things like creating plain, easy to read language versions of complicated information, yes, absolutely. We can see the positive sides of artificial intelligence in making things easier to understand. Um, in some other areas where it oversteps the boundary from um, a transformative mechanism to something that generates something from nothing, there is a long way to go. And I think there is a level of distrust there that is justified, quite
Hmm.
frankly.
Yeah,
Um, so I think it depends on what kind of artificial intelligence you're talking about.
right. Although we'll arrange another conversation in 6 months and see if that answer has changed. I bet it has to some extent. And last question, just one piece of advice you'd give to organizations who are looking at ways to use AI to help with their accessibility efforts rather than hinder those efforts. What would your one piece of advice be to organizations?
I think it would be use AI as a tool to assist human processes. Don't rely on it as something that replaces human functionality, particularly in regard to digital accessibility. Use it as something that helps, not something that replaces human effort.
Yeah, no, well said. I think that's great advice. Well, I think yeah, we'll stop it there, but I know that we could carry this conversation on for another 2, 3 hours. But the good news is I'm sure we'll find more time to catch up later in the year and see how things have changed. Thank you, Ricky, so much for sharing your perspective today. That was a great conversation. And like I say, I know that AI and its influence on accessibility efforts is only going to change and evolve over time. So, well, now you know the state of accessibility. I'm David Sloan, thanking Ricky Onsman and reminding you that the state of accessibility is always changing. So please help us affect change.